Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for September 10th, 2021. It's Friday, so I'll be taking a couple of questions, very good questions that came in from the viewers, but I want to begin with just a brief introduction, going back to this question of the role of Tony Blair as one of the most important war criminals of the recent period. Blair, who as British Prime Minister was responsible for producing the dossiers from British intelligence on so-called weapons of mass destruction held by Saddam Hussein, who was very much involved in pushing for the Afghan invasion initially, and who is still speaking out, saying it's imbecilic to end the forever wars. So he participated in an online event yesterday, and he made the following comments. First of all, he said, there's no question it was Osama bin Laden acting from Afghanistan who was solely responsible for the attacks on 9/11/2001. Secondly, he said the war on terror was necessary, and it still is. It must continue as radical Islam is the greatest threat to humanity. Third, he reasserted that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction. It was a fake dossier from MI6 that was given to Dick Cheney and George Bush that was used by Colin Powell to get agreement from the United Nations for the attack on Iraq. But Blair knew it was fabricated, but he's still saying it's true. And of course, they never found any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Fourth, he reasserted the idea of the necessity for interventionist wars under the doctrine of responsibility to protect, which essentially means no nation has a sovereign right to defend itself, to protect its own borders and its own people. This goes back to what Blair was pushing beginning in 1999, but it has a much longer history going back to the global bankers, including people like Walt Wriston, who wrote a book called Twilight of Sovereignty in the 80s, as they were pushing to end the idea of national sovereignty in order to create a global bankers' dictatorship, which is now the explicit intent of the Great Reset, a central bankers' dictatorship, which of course Blair supports as a representative of the City of London and a member of the Queen's Privy Council. And finally, he said, we must have a long-term view. We can't defend our values if we have a short-term view against those who have a long-term view, that is, radical Islam, Russia, and China. Now, Blair's imperial arrogance was a perfect fit for the Project for a New American Century unilateralists, centered around Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, and others. There was a quote I found from the New York Times Magazine in 2004 which exemplifies this. It was an anonymous White House official, probably Karl Rove, who said, quote, "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left just to study what we do," unquote. Well, I would recommend we take them up on that. Study what they did and hold people accountable for it, because we're coming out of a period of 20 years of destructive wars that killed more than 1 million people, that disrupted many nations, and that are continuing with things such as the Caesar sanctions against the Syrian population, with the war going on in Yemen, with continued troops in Iraq and Syria, that this should be studied to make sure we don't accept the axioms of the British Empire, of the geopolitics, which put us in these situations. There is no credibility or legitimacy to the idea of a unipolar world enforced by military might. And that's something that we have to get the American people to mobilize, to understand, and to stop. Now, let me start with the first question, which came up yesterday in an interview I did on a radio show, but then a couple of you wrote in and asked something similar. What's behind the financial regulatory changes going on in China? Now, one of these is the establishment of a new stock exchange for small and medium enterprises. And if you look at the financial press and in the literature, you'll find that the general consensus is that they're trying to insulate China from the coming global financial crisis, which makes sense. The Chinese have been very wary to open their banking system, unwilling to do it, even though they've been promised lots of aid if they do. But they want to eliminate the dependence on foreign financial markets, which makes sense because the Chinese are operating with a kind of Hamiltonian credit system in which the government provides credit to the financial institutions specifically for physical economic production. Now, this is exemplified in the second case, the refusal to bail out Evergrande, which is a giant real estate company which has more than $100 billion in foreign debt. Now, the government refused to bail it out, and people are saying, well, this is a systemic crisis for China. Well, the fact is that over half of the debt held by Evergrande is owed to foreign investors. And the Chinese are moving against speculation. The Chinese economy is dependent on advances in physical goods production, scientific technologies, engineering, the Belt and Road Initiative. That's physical goods production, not speculation. And so they're trying to discourage very forcefully speculators from coming in thinking they can make a bundle at the expense of the Chinese people. They're not closing the door on foreign investment. They're just saying that you'll do foreign investment on our terms. Is that a violation of free market policy? Well, it's a necessary violation. There are aspects of the free market policy which are destructive, intentionally destructive. In order to make more profit, the shutting down of competition in the name of competition. That's what free market policies do. They discourage competition by rewarding growth. And the larger a company becomes, the more monopolistic its practices, the more it's accessible, has credit accessibility, and so on. Well, the Chinese don't like that. They actually believe that there has to be a credit policy that benefits the physical economy first, because that's where the general welfare is best served. So that's what's going on in China, at least as a first approximation. Now, the next questions, and again, some of these have come up in interviews I've done in the last few days, but also from viewers writing in. One person asked in particular, wasn't 9/11 an inside job? And related to that is, do you really think Biden's order to declassify the documents will make a difference? Well, let's take up the inside job question. There are a lot of things we do know that made the U.S. susceptible to the attacks of 9/11. We know this because there were NSA whistleblowers, National Security Agency whistleblowers, including Bill Binney, who is a technical director of the NSA, his co-worker Kirk Wiebe, and Thomas Drake, a whistleblower who was jailed. Now, what they exposed is that they had developed a program for surveillance called Thin Thread, which they said would have picked up critical intelligence prior to 9/11, which could have prevented 9/11. The Thin Thread program was specific targeting, and it had privacy protections, and it was cheap, but it was shut down by NSA Director General Hayden. And instead, what was imposed was something called Trailblazer. The Trailblazer program, first of all, was many-fold times more expensive. Secondly, it collected metadata. That is everything. It sucked up all email communication, phone communication, every form of communication among ordinary citizens. Not targeted, but everyone. It was part of what Snowden later exposed as the invasive surveillance state. It lacked the privacy protection of Thin Thread. Now, here's the real point here. Thin Thread was ready for operation in January 2001 when it was shut down. And shortly after that, after 9/11, Binney and Wiebe became whistleblowers. On January 3rd, 2001, at the same time Hayden was shutting down the Thin Thread program, Lyndon LaRouche did a webcast where he warned that we were likely to see a Reichstag fire event. That is an attack that was used as an excuse for an emergency, a declaration of emergency, which would take away freedom and turn over to the state the power to spy, to make arrests, and so on. That's exactly what happened with 9/11. 9/11 was a Reichstag fire event. It occurred, and it was used for not just the spying operation, the surveillance state, but also to tighten control over finances, to accelerate spying on foreign governments, not just foreign terrorists. I mean, there are many things that Angela Merkel is, but she's not a terrorist. Yet we bugged her cell phone. So you had with Binney and others this understanding that we needed the targeted surveillance, not the general police state measures. Now, Bill Binney will be speaking at the Schiller Institute Forum tomorrow on 9/11, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Go to theschillerinstitute.com to register for that. Ray McGovern will also be speaking, along with Helga Zepp-LaRouche and some others. Now, the second question, will Biden's declassification make a difference? Well, in itself, probably not. We don't know how much of the documents have been destroyed or totally redacted or what's available. The FBI is not known for self-exposure. In fact, the FBI has done everything it can to cover up what it knew about 9/11. But this is where we get to an important point for organizing. The Families United for 9/11 victims has kept up the pressure for declassification, the demand that the Saudi role in 9/11 be investigated. There are many aspects to this that I just don't have the time to go into right now, but one of them was the free passage that was allowed for Saudis from the United States when all other air traffic was shut down after 9/11. They were loaded up on planes and flown back to Saudi Arabia. So that's just one question. 80,000 documents in the Sarasota, Florida FBI office that have never really been made public. These are things that are important to look at. But much more important is this idea of the public pressure and the demand. Don't depend on the FBI to self-expose. Don't depend on the Justice Department to do the work or the Congressional Intelligence Committees. It's got to be the American people who demand it. And while we're at it, let's get declassified the John F. Kennedy assassination files, the 9/11 files, and the Russiagate files. We know a lot about Russiagate because there was a lot of fight around it. But there's still aspects of that which are covered up. And this includes the transmission of fake evidence, fabricated evidence from British intelligence, from MI6, through Christopher Steele, through Richard Dearloff, the former MI6 director, and others, who passed on fake dossiers about Russian intervention, which became part of the narrative that was used to prevent Donald Trump from having a more close relationship develop with Vladimir Putin. So we've been living under this security state operation, which attacks all of our freedom, but also which attacks the freedom of policymakers to break out of the control of the shadow government. So will this investigation in itself, the declassification ordered by Biden, accomplish everything that's necessary? Probably not. But it's useful in two ways. One is it will make more documents available, but more importantly, it shows that persistent organizing by American citizens can move the government. We had a chance with President Trump, had he gone ahead with the massive public declassification of documents, we had a chance to get to the bottom of some of this. It didn't happen. We shouldn't then shrug our shoulders and say, well, they're too powerful. They're not too powerful, and they're not that bright. Keep the pressure up. And part of that is to join with the Schiller Institute, because we've been at the forefront of exposing this criminal cabal going back to the period of the Carter administration, when the Trilateral Commission, on behalf of corporate cartels, took over the U.S. government lock, stock, and barrel. Join us Saturday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the schillerinstitute.com for our next exposure of these crimes, and more importantly, what is the alternative? How do we move from geopolitical confrontation and criminal financial fraud into an era of common economic development? That will be 2 p.m. Saturday at the schillerinstitute.com. I hope to see you then. I'll be co-moderating the panel.